The voice in your head isn't actually yours. And the strangest part, you've been listening to it your whole life without ever asking who's broadcasting. When we are born, there is silence. Not peace, not wisdom, just silence. No narrator, no commentary, no explanation. And then one day, a day none of us remember, something begins to speak. A stove appears in front of you and the voice says, hot. A vending machine lights up and the voice says, chocolate. At first, this voice feels practical, helpful, almost like subtitles for reality. Eventually, we learn a very powerful word, I. This is when the voice changes. It stops just labeling the world and starts labeling us. It begins to narrate our desires and our discomforts. I want, I need, I am hungry, I am scared. In those early chapters, it feels like we and the voice are a single braided cord. It expresses exactly how we feel in the moment. There is no gap between the emotion and the word. However, as the years go by, something curious happens. The voice seems to take on a life of its own. It moves from being a helpful assistant to being a permanent houseguest who never stops talking. When a difficult feeling strikes us, the voice might not just say, I am sad. It might start to judge that sadness. It might mock us, shame us, or tell us that the world is a rigged game where we are destined to lose. And that raises a quiet question. If this voice is truly me, we might ask ourselves why we would ever try to bring ourselves down. If it is our own creation, why can't we simply flip a switch and enjoy the silence of the nursery once again? Why does it seem to repeat the cynical views of a neighbor, the harsh criticisms of a friend, or the fearful headlines of the morning news? So maybe there's another way to imagine what's happening. Not as a voice that is us, but as radio broadcast. What if our thoughts are less like commands and more like pulling water from a well? Deep inside, there is something wordless, heavy, emotional, unsorted. Call it the subconscious, or memory, or simply experience. We lower a bucket into it and pull something up. Then we try to describe what we got. Right now, that's easy. I'm upset, I'm sad, I'm happy. Those are fresh feelings, still warm. The trouble starts when we lower the bucket into the past, because the world moves faster than we can emotionally process it. Imagine watching a movie at 10 times the speed. You would catch fragments, a gesture, a face, a moment. Now imagine being strapped into a theater seat, unable to leave, while movie after movie plays, all of them at 10 times speed. What would you do? You might watch the new film with one eye, just to keep up, and with the other you might glance backward, trying to remember what you just saw, trying to explain to yourself what it meant, how it made you feel, who you were supposed to be in it. That's the human experience. If life unfolded at a pace we could fully digest, we might say something like this: from birth to death, I was calm. I always knew who I was. I always understood what was happening. I always knew what to do next. But no one says that, because there has never been a calm life from start to finish. There are storms, there is mud, there are stretches where everything happens at once. By the time we reach adulthood, we have been processing these frantic images for so long that we mistake the translation for the truth. We hear the voice in our head and we think it is still that same clear, simple tool that told us the stove was hot or that we wanted chocolate. But it has stopped being that. The voice is now a tired, overworked narrator trying to sort through the feelings of 1,000 overlapping movies. If that were the case, it might explain something familiar. Why a single memory can suddenly rewrite how you feel about yourself. Why a sentence from someone else can echo for years. Why the voice can feel harsh even when no one is speaking. It might also explain why the voice often speaks in absolutes. Always, never, everyone, no one. Those sound less like feelings and more like shortcuts. And shortcuts make sense when the system is overloaded. So perhaps the voice is not an enemy. And perhaps it is not a guide either. Perhaps it is closer to background noise. And if that is even slightly true, it opens an interesting possibility that not every thought needs to be obeyed, and not every thought needs to be fought. Some might simply be echoes. Some might be unfinished translations. Some might belong to moments that are still being processed in the dark. This does not mean the voice is useless. It still warns us about heat. It still notices hunger. It still points toward chocolate. But maybe it stopped being a mirror a long time ago. Maybe now it is more like a collage, cuttings from 1,000 conversations, arranged quickly, presented confidently. And maybe the work is not to silence it, but to recognize it, to notice when it is describing the present and when it is sorting through an archive at impossible speed. Because if life really is a theater of overlapping films, then confusion is not a personal failure, it is a side effect of volume. You're hearing delayed broadcasts, old signals, translations of feelings that have been waiting in line, and sometimes, if you're not careful, if you're not paying close attention, the voice might be speaking someone else's opinion and presenting it as your own. Your friend's fear, your culture's shame, a friend's insecurity, a stranger's cruelty from a moment you've consciously forgotten but emotionally remember. The radio plays it all, and when you're not aware that it's a radio, you assume it's just you. So what might we do about this? What options exist when you realize the voice might not be as trustworthy as you assumed? One possibility might be to notice. That's it. Just notice when the voice speaks and ask, does this sound like me right now? Or does this sound like an old recording? Does this sound like my own conclusion? Or does it sound like something I absorbed from someone else and never questioned? We can acknowledge that the narrator is doing its best to translate a very fast, very confusing show, but that its translation is not the final word on who we are. Think of it like listening to a radio and finally realizing you can change the station. You might not be able to turn it off entirely. Maybe the radio is just part of having a human mind, but you might be able to adjust the volume. You might be able to recognize when you're hearing static versus signal. Another possibility is to feed the well better water. What you consume, who you spend time with, the environments you place yourself in, all of it eventually gets pulled up by the bucket. If you spend years around negative voices, don't be surprised when that's what the well gives back. And perhaps the most useful possibility, you might start asking the voice questions instead of just believing it. The voice says, you're not good enough. Instead of accepting that as truth, you might ask, good enough for what? According to whom? Based on what evidence? And when was this opinion formed? Sometimes, when you interrogate the voice, it gets quieter, as if it wasn't expecting to be questioned, as if it only had power when it went unchallenged. Here's something worth considering. Beneath all the chatter, beneath the radio static and the backlog of unprocessed films and the murky water from the well, there might be something else, something quieter. Some people call it awareness. Some people call it presence. It doesn't really matter what name you give it. The point is, there seems to be a part of you that can watch the voice without being the voice. A part that can hear the broadcast and recognize it as a broadcast. A part that existed before the radio turned on and will exist after the static fades. It is possible that the silence we were born with never actually left us. Maybe it is still there, underneath the narration, like the quiet floor of the ocean. If we can learn to sit with that silence, even for a moment, we might find a version of ourselves that doesn't need to be translated into words to be real. That part doesn't judge, doesn't shame, doesn't predict doom or dwell on the past. It just watches. And maybe, just maybe, that's closer to who you actually are than anything the voice has ever said. We started with a newborn in silence, no opinions, no inner critic, just pure, unfiltered experience. And then the radio clicked on. It's been playing ever since, sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful, often just noise dressed up as wisdom. The question isn't whether you can turn the radio off. It might be wired into the walls. The question is whether you can recognize it for what it is. Because once you know there's a radio, once you understand that not every broadcast is true, not every voice is yours, not every opinion was formed by the person you are today, something shifts. You might still hear the static, you might still catch old signals playing at odd hours, but you'll listen differently now. You'll remember that the radio was already playing when you were born. And that means someone else chose the first station.